Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final session for day one of the Start Network Assembly 2022. The close out recording will follow this one. But first, let's get cracking around risk and innovation. My name is Ian Burbage, and I'm the new Head of Systems Innovation and Change here at Start Network. I'm here with my colleagues, Joanna Pearson, who's new Head of Assurance, and Verity from the membership team, and Praz doing tech support in the background. So thank you to them and to everyone who's helped us put on the day's worth of events. Today, in this session, we'll explore, by way of an update, our work around risk and accountability, surely saving the most interesting session to the end. I'm sure you'll agree. We've already today heard lots of inspiring stories from our members about practical innovations and changes that they're bringing about in their communities. And we're going to shift focus a little bit in this session and look at an important set of issues in the wider system that at best enables, or at worst hinders, locally community-led responses to crisis and disaster. And that's the mechanisms that we use around risk, managing risk and ensuring accountability. I was thinking earlier, it's a bit like the wiring in a house. You know, when it works well, no one notices it. But when it's faulty, there's a risk of catastrophic failure. And that means that even if we think it's working well, we need to pay it due attention. Further, I think it's impossible to achieve our ambition of a locally led humanitarian system without looking at ways of rethinking risk and accountability and exploring ways of doing it differently, ways that are in line with our mission. So in this session, the aim is to review the progress we've made in the last year or so. I'll share some of the insights gained and some of the lessons learned, take a look at some of the prototypes and experiments that our members, hubs, sector partners help develop. And finally, look at the intentions for testing these prototypes moving forwards over the coming weeks, months, and year. We only have half an hour for what's a deep and complex subject, and one I know we all care about. I'll spend about 20 minutes giving you an overview of where we're at, a bit of a stock take on this topic, with apologies that we don't have members' voices around this work today, but rest assured they've been central to the work to date and will continue to be so moving forwards. We'll have about 10 minutes for a Q&A at the end, where we'll respond to any questions that you raise. And to do so, please share your questions, comments, observations in the chat on the Zoom, or you can use the Q&A button to ask a question of us. And whilst we might not be able to get to all of them, we'll certainly capture them and share a response after today's event. There are other ways that you can engage in this work moving forwards. You can email me your thoughts and your ideas, and my email address is on the slide deck that you'll have access to after this session. And of course, if you're in London in person, then come find me and the team at the marketplace. We'll be at the Barbican over the next 2 days, and I'd love to talk to some of you there. So a summary then of where we're at. This was identified in 2020 as a critical barrier to locally led humanitarian action, the need to reimagine risk and accountability. Last year at the Assembly, we launched an initiative in this space which aimed to explore new approaches for assessing and managing risk. We worked with an organisation called Humentum, who led us through a design process through which we explored new approaches and tools for assessing and managing risk in a way that intends to put accountability to crisis-affected people and communities at the heart of our work, at the heart of the humanitarian system. And in doing so, remove some of the barriers to access funding that local organisations face. This work came up with a list of new ideas to test, and I'll run through some of those in a moment. Stakeholders in these conversations included the hub organisations, staff and peers within and without of the sector, trying to bring in a range of ideas. The process that we followed was a three-phase approach. Phase one was to really understand the problem, to explore the issues that underpin risk and accountability. And we generated 4 core insights at the heart of this. The first is that the prevailing approaches to risk management are seen as one of the most important blockers to locally led humanitarian action. The second is that international NGOs often find themselves holding the risk both for their funders, but also for their implementing partners, whilst local and national members say that due diligence frameworks don't take into account their particular local strengths and knowledge of local context. Third, that the conversation around decolonising the sector has highlighted the perception of due diligence as a sort of Western judgment and standards of aid, continuing to perpetuate the current power distribution. And finally, fourthly, it's still based on upward accountability to donors as opposed to downward accountability to the very people that would benefit from the funding. So having teased out those 4 core insights, phase 2 is about getting creative in terms of developing responses to those. And we clustered the ideas that came up through this process over the last 12 months under 5 challenge areas. I'm going to briefly summarize them now. So challenge 1 is called Communities Choose, whereby communities affected by crisis and disaster agree what support they need and from whom. Challenge 2 enables working through the best placed suppliers, how to get money most quickly and securely to local and community organisations. Challenge 3 is about ensuring we value local organisations' inherent strengths, enabling them to invest in their own organisations. Challenge 4 is about transparency of aid, knowing what's spent with decentralised decision-making and power exercised by those closest to the crisis. And safe aid providers, challenge 5, reducing exploitation and abuse by humanitarian organisations. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail now in order to try and put a little bit more context behind those headlines. And in doing so, I'm going to illustrate one prototype or experiment from each of these areas. So the first challenge is Communities Choose, whereby affected communities agree the support that they need and from whom they need it. And the core question that we were exploring here is how can funding mechanisms and the supply chain of response providers be organised and operated in such a way as it puts affected communities at their heart. In response, there were 5 prototypes or experiments that were designed and developed. And one of them I've pulled out here as an illustration is community commissioned monitoring and audit. In this experiment, the donor would contract a third party to monitor or audit the project, but that third party is accountable to the target communities, and it's those communities who define what success looks like. That's an inversion, if you like, of the current way in which normally it's the agency that defines quality and reports back. So it's a way of inverting the current system. So that's challenge 1. Challenge 2 is to work through the best place supplier, how to get money quickly and securely to local and community organizations. And that's the core question here. How can international funding mechanisms and responses be best organized to channel that funding as quickly and securely as possible? Now, there are 6 prototypes or experiment areas here. One that I've pulled out is, how do we quantify trust in order to make better funding decisions? What does that look like as part of the system? We know that fraud, bullying, and sexual abuse by staff are often symptoms of deeper issues related to leadership and culture and power. And yet, due diligence and assurance systems can miss these. So in this experiment, we'd look to create an accountability through trust framework, through which we would seek to measure these kind of intangibles around trust. What does a trustworthy organization look like in terms of risk management? And how does that compare with more traditional compliance-based due diligence systems? So really interesting alternative, or perhaps another way of thinking about what good looks like for in terms of local organizations. And we know that trust and relationships are crucial in work such as this. The third challenge area is about valuing local organizations' strengths and enabling investment in those organizations. When I used to invest in community groups in the UK, in my job in local government, it was really easy to invest in the projects that those groups were delivering on the ground, but it was much harder to make the case to invest in those organizations themselves to ensure that they're growing, that they're putting processes and procedures in place that work for them, that enable their staff to grow. And it's important to find ways of doing that, because it's that social capital that these groups develop is so crucial. From the 4 prototypes and experiments, I pulled out one based on the UK's National Lottery Community Fund. They've taken a strengths-based relational approach to one of their grant funding streams, which values community organisations who do grow their own capacity and skills and knowledge and connections in order to work most effectively. Sometimes that's thought of in terms of infrastructure support, but those organisations are really important. Ensuring those organisations are growing and able to respond. Challenge 4 is about transparency of aid and knowing what's spent with decentralised decision-making and power exercised by those closest to the crisis. And the key question here is, how could a different approach to financial planning and management and reporting increase transparency to all stakeholders and add value to the processes and support more adaptive programming? Because certainly here in the West, we like to tie all of this down in neat processes, but that's not necessarily enabling us to respond as flexibly as we might want to. So there were a number of experiments and prototypes that came out in the work over the last 12 months in this space. 7, I think. One looks outside the sector for inspiration and suggests that we work with the identity arm of a bank to develop third-party verification processes that not only keeps data safe, but also verifies and ranks local organizations, enabling the money to get to them most quickly. So ways almost of using existing information and verifying the suitability and the fit of organizations in a way that can be much more automated and perhaps therefore offer a lower barrier to entry. And finally, the 5th challenge area around safe aid providers. The challenge of reducing exploitation and abuse by humanitarian organizations leads to the question about how can funding mechanisms and supply chains gain assurance over whether the arrangements to mitigate these risks are adequate. And perhaps more importantly, how can those who access assistance be confident that the provider is taking steps to protect them from harm. 4 prototype experiment ideas put forward. One is around community feedback loops, whereby feedback from communities, whether positive or negative or neutral, is brought together and analysed and overlaid with mapping of who's funding what, so that there's transparency for everybody, from communities to government to donors, to see what's going well and what's not, who's doing well and where there are unmet needs. Lots, I think, to unpack around using that local intelligence and insight. So those are 5 challenge areas. In total, something like 24 prototype and experiments to think about, which leads us to phase 3, which is where we are now, to select the prototypes that we want to work with and to find ways of testing, learning, developing them, applying them in practice, and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work. Perhaps as importantly as anything is making sure that learning is embedded through the work that we do. So how might we do that? Well, there are a number of innovation mechanisms that we might think about. We might work with members and others to co-create, co-design solutions. We might go down a more traditional route with calls for solutions or joint solutions or responses to tenders. We might put an experimental fund together. We might create an innovation sandpit where we suspend normal kind of rules and procedures and experiment around what alternatives could look like. Perhaps we might create a prize fund, or we might design an innovation lab to bring one of these prototypes in and to develop it together. All of those are options, and part of the art here is going to be moving forwards to match the right or the most appropriate feeling mechanism with the experiment that we want to take forwards. And in doing so, I think there's a number of principles that can guide our work. These were previously pulled together by those that have engaged in this work over the last 12 months or so. Crucial is balancing the needs of all stakeholders and ensuring that this is locally led. Part of that is going to be important to create a safe space for people to come together and to engage on these topics, which are thorny, and there's not going to be necessarily a straightforward solution to this. We need a space where we can have potentially uncomfortable but stimulating conversations on some of these topics. We need permission for genuine experimentation, because genuine experimentation means we don't know what the answer looks like, but we're testing and we're learning. And in many respects, if we're not experimenting broadly or widely enough, if we're not creating fail points or things that don't quite work as we expect, then we're not pushing the boundary enough, and we're probably not learning enough. That said, we need strong commitment to ethical considerations. And we need to be looking at keeping our eyes open and not being fixed on a particular endpoint, but really seeing this as a way of learning about the wider system. So to bring that down to the next actions that we see moving forwards, I think there's a task to sense check these issues and the prototypes experiments for 2023. There were, I think, 24, 24 of them. I think it's important to see them as a whole, as an innovation portfolio. And in seeing them as a whole, to sense check that collectively they're driving us towards our ambitions for system change, to make sure that there are no obvious gaps. And actually to see if perhaps some of those prototypes or innovations, experiments are first amongst equals. By which I mean, perhaps there are some experiments that by taking those forwards first help create the possibility, help create the space for some of the other ones to come alongside them at a later date. And so the timing of this work as a portfolio, I think, is going to be really important. Clearly, how best to involve you all as members, our donors, our wider stakeholders and staff is going to be crucial, as is the resourcing, and internally, I think within Start Network, to think about how we're going to share this with the wider world in terms of comms and engagement, in terms of sharing what we're learning, and making sure that the building blocks of good work are in place around ethics, around monitoring, evaluation and learning, and so on. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to offer an opportunity for my colleague Joanna, if she would like to unmute and share any reflections that she might have, equally new to the role and to Start Network as me, before we open up, and we'll try and respond to any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, from my perspective as the new head of assurance, this is a really intriguing and interesting piece of work for me to look at what is interesting from the members, from the hubs, and where issues are thought and felt to be, and how we can potentially look at this going forward and understand the needs and wants and be able to deliver something that creates something that suits everybody in a way that's comfortable for us all to work together. I think it's a very broad piece of work when we're talking about risk and accountability that covers almost all areas, and it's going to be interesting to see the feedback and the engagement and how this works going forward next year, as Ian said, in terms of a project and the timing of the types of work that we'll need to do to create something new going forward. So yeah, it's fantastically interesting for me as a relatively new starter. So I'm looking forward to hearing any questions and any feedback. And as Ian said at the beginning as well, I will be at the Barbican on Thursday. So also, if anyone wants to come and chat in person, that's very much welcome as well.
Thanks, Joanna. So I'm wondering, as I'm still screen sharing, whether we have any questions or comments from anybody in the chat. Verity, I don't know if you're having a look for us.
We don't have any questions yet in the chat. So if anyone has any thoughts, comments that they want to share, please put it in the chat and I can read it out and let Ian and Joanna respond.
I appreciate this is a lot of information to take on board at the end of a long day, for those of you that have dialed into every session so far today.
We have a question from Mark from Concern, one of our members, and he's asking, can you please explain a bit more about the framework of accountability through trust?
Thanks, Mark. I can give you a little bit of an overview based on what I talked about earlier. And I think the key thing here is to develop a framework that sits alongside more traditional compliance-based frameworks, and to figure out what the criteria would be in any such framework. So if we were assessing organizations based on the sort of intangibles around trust, and the sort of operations and relationships within an organization, then how might we do that? I think it's very early stages at this point in terms of taking that forwards, but there's certainly something for me about what the more traditional due diligence or accountability assessments potentially miss when it comes to those intangible qualities that we all know show up in organizations are working effectively, and yet it's really hard to quantify what that looks like. So I think it's very early stages, but something interesting to unpack in much more detail.
Thanks, Ian. Hopefully that answers Mark's question. We've got two more. So Ben Robinson noted that he's really interested in scalability these days, given the ever-growing humanitarian space. So how do you see these 24 innovations transforming the global humanitarian system?
That's a fab question. If only we had like about 3 days to unpack that, Ben. I think where I was talking about these 24 innovations as being like a portfolio, the key thing for me is how they're complementary to each other, and how in addressing those issues that we identified, they're working towards that overall ambition and mission of Start Network around locally led approaches to humanitarian action. And I think that's the thread that runs through them all for me. I think where I shared some of the principles to guide this work that have previously been designed, something about what local accountability looks like is at the heart of this for me. And I touched earlier on my experience in local government in the UK. It's actually quite hard to invert such entrenched systems that are used to money coming from geographically or politically more powerful places, and how to trust local organisations to do what they know is right with the funding, rather than to do what the donor or the provider of the funding thinks is best. And so the challenge there for me is, if we can start to showcase, as we've heard and seen during the day today, local examples of change that are illustrating and evidencing a different way and an alternative way of doing this, then I think that starts to shift the system in imperceptible ways.
Great, really interesting, thank you. I think Ben's noted his contact details, so I've just saved them so we can get in contact potentially about collaboration.
Thanks, Ben.
We also have a comment from Hugo, who is in the leadership team of our Guatemala hub, and he noted that nothing was said about decolonisation in this call.
I think that's a fair point, Hugo. I think it's been more implicit than explicit. I think for me, the whole purpose of all of these experiments and this whole program of work is about unraveling and redesigning a way of doing accountability and assessing risk that isn't based on Western, colonial, hierarchical, patriarchal, we know best, elitist ways of seeing the world. And I think a crucial thing as we take this forwards is to ensure that the START decolonisation framework is used as a lens through which we look at all of this work, and ensuring that, the thing that I want to avoid is that we don't see these experiments as little fireworks that go off here and there as we do a piece of work, but collectively they have to have some coherence and impact towards the mission, and that mission has to be about decolonisation of the sector, as you know. And I think we can use the decolonisation framework perhaps more explicitly than I've outlined it here today to guide that work moving forwards. But I'd love you to continuously stress test us and check us on that, as with other network members.
Great, that was the last comment in the chat, and I think we're at time.
Thank you, everybody. Well, if I may just take the last 30 seconds to thank you all for joining and all for engaging on what can appear at surface value to be a dry topic to end the day. Hopefully you found it a useful sense check of where this work is at, and excitement about how we're going to take it forwards. It is important that you continue to engage with this so far as you're willing and able, and I'd love you to do that. As I say, we're around at the next 2 days. My email will be available for you So you can message me. Thank you all for your time and attention. It's been an inspiring day. It's been my first assembly experience and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you, everybody. I hope to see you soon, and wherever you are in the world, have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.